Hello everyone, Master Xeon1201 here, and in this release log we'll be going over the changes between Boxcutter 718, the initial launch, all the way up to 718_3. For this, the implementation of 3D dots has finally began, which is a expansion of our previous system, which was 2D locked and was kind of limiting with the work we want to do with grid. Speaking of grid, I mentioned previously that a new grid was coming. This is the release where that new grid is here, so we'll be talking about that today. When it comes to Boxcutter, Mac is always a topic of discussion. However, it isn't because we love a Mac, it's because we just need it to work properly with all OSs, and Mac is just something that's always going to be a point of contention with us internally, and this release of course is no exception. Repeat has also improved to a great level, and we'll be going over that as well, where now it can support vertex groups as far as repeating shapes to a more accurate extent. 2.93 can be a little bit of a pain. However, I am a glutton for pain, and I'm always looking forward to seeing what kind of bugs we're going to be experiencing in the future. So while I personally am always using 2.93, it is definitely a little bit unstable, so Blender's going to be Blender, expect weirdness. And before closing, I just want to also mention that performance was also a theme of this update as well. We're always aiming for increasing performance and getting things to work faster, and this release of course is no exception, so I'm proud that speed has been increased so much for this particular update. And last but not least, our pie menu has always been the same thing for the last releases of Boxcutter, with little to no innovation changing with it. For this update, we introduce a new version of pie that should be a lot simpler, and we aim to just reapproach the pie for Boxcutter from scratch, and you'll be seeing it change throughout subsequent updates of Boxcutter. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in and go over what's new. When it comes to Boxcutter, pressing D brings up the pie menu. In the past, we've attempted to do everything in the pie menu and have it fit most of the options that accommodate. However, over time, it has become a little unwieldy to the point that we felt the need to attempt something a little bit cleaner for this release. So as a result, in the behavior panel under display, there's now an option for simple pie. And by toggling this, you can now see that whenever you press D, that the pie is a lot more simplified, where basically you'll be able to jump to your function that you want to do, and you'll also be able to choose draw line or wedge. And same with Ngon, you'll be able to go in and jump it over to cyclic or lasso depending on the state that you need for Ngon. And with custom, we can see that with custom we simply have just draw line and wedge as its alternative behaviors that you're able to jump to. We'll be expanding more on this pie as our releases go on, but I just wanted to let it be known that this is the release that we are going to try working on a new pie for this particular version of Boxcutter. So here we are in 2.83 LTS using Boxcutter 717.18. So with our robot here, we'll just press D to jump into our pie menu and switch to custom, and we'll press C in order to make this the custom cutter. So after deselecting it, we'll now begin drawing this, and we can see that the initial draw is just a little bit choppy, a little bit choppier than we'd want it to be for such a heavy mesh. Of course, this mesh is 90,000 verts, but we're just going to bring this up and tab to make it live and click to apply, and there we are, of course, able to draw the mesh that we had selected. So let's try that one more time, and we'll just draw the mesh out, press tab to pause, press R to rotate until we get it at just the angle that we want, maybe facing forward like so. We'll grab the extrude dot, bring it up, hold shift in order to snap it to 1:1, and there we have drawn this spot facing forward just like the other one. So we will attempt to draw it again, and we see that with each subsequent draw that it begins to get a little bit slower and a little bit choppier with this, because this is such a heavy asset, and this is something that's just a battle of us and speed, and it's something that we're always trying to mitigate, and this release of course is no exception. So here you've seen me attempt it using our previous version, using the LTS as kind of a test bed. If we minimize this, we're now over in Blender 2.93, which is where I spend most of my time, and here I'm using Boxcutter 718.0. And so for this, we'll do the same thing. We'll press D, switch over to custom, and if we press C, we can deselect this, and let's just begin drawing it. And we see that already it feels a lot more springier and responsive than it did previously. So we hold shift to bring it out, we bring it up, tab to live, and we don't even have to tab to live. I just like tabbing to live to look at it right before we apply it. So we'll do the same thing again. We'll draw it out, hold shift, and while we may never get absolutely the speed that we want, it's just something that I'm happy to announce that has been improved in this version, is that you should definitely notice a speed improvement. So we'll just continue drawing these, and there we go, and I'll draw another one here, and we'll just see how quick I can actually draw these things, of course keeping their proportions. Proportions was a big focal point of one of our previous releases, so it's one of the things I'm always testing to make sure it remains intact, because being able to draw shapes exactly the proportion and depth that you took them in is something that's important. And here you see me drawing this army of robots to really bring that point home. So here we'll press R to rotate. I was about to press Shift tilde, which would have rotated inside, giving us a most undesired result. But here we are just drawing an army of robots, just showing how much faster everything is now in this version of Boxcutter compared to its last one. And not saying that this was something that you couldn't do with an earlier version. It's just something that I'm now able to see is visibly a lot better. Normally speed optimizations is one of those things I try to avoid talking about in update logs, because it always triggers people to come back and argue that things are truly not any faster because they're using a potato system or whatever the case may be, or AMD hardware, whatever it may be. This one is definitely one that will be changing things from here on out because of how fast it's making things go. And these same optimizations are also coming to HardOps as well, but just want to show that now custom drawing and our ability to draw with heavy meshes has now been optimized multifold. One of the things we've attempted to do over the previous versions of Boxcutter is offer an alternative way to perform the extrusion operation. Under the behavior panel, you can go under input, and there's an option for alternative extrude where you can disable alternative extrude from occurring in the event you want things to continue behaving like classic. But if we turn on grid and we press D to switch over to circle, we can bring out a view grid by pressing control off of the mesh, and by starting here we can just draw our circle aligned with view and not with the surface, and then we begin moving the mouse. We can begin extruding according to the amount that we're moving the mouse, and we can see the extrusion amount being displayed at the bottom. And we can even bring in another grid aligned to the center and just move and continue performing these extrusion operations just aligned to view without having to worry about anything when it comes to rotating the view or getting a perfect position. We're able to just continue working in this particular area without having to give any consideration to the surrounding area. And of course, performing a laser cut is nothing when it comes to Boxcutter. That's something that's always been able to do. However, the ability to perform a view-based extrusion like you're seeing here is something that is still fairly new, and we're still in the process of getting refined to perfection. Sometimes the system can get in the way. For example, if I press D and I switch over to box, if we begin drawing a box, we can see that moving the mouse down moves the extrusion down, but if I move the mouse to the left, the extrusion continues to go down. If I move it to the right, it continues to go down. And if I move it up, it continues to go down. And this is because it requires that you put the mouse cursor specifically near the origin of the extrusion start in order to reset the extrusion back to 0. And this can be something a little bit daunting to new users, and for that reason, tapping Alt will actually revert the extrusion system back to the previous way so that users can easily take their extrusion back to 0 and constrain their extrusion operation back to a simple up-down maneuver. So this is something we still aim to resolve and have even better in future updates, where Extrude System B will possibly only show up in the event of certain view vectors being aligned perfectly head-on, versus surface being something where you're looking at it from a corner and it's definitely obvious that Extrude System A would preferably be used in this situation. But this is something that we'll continue to be working on over subsequent versions of Boxcutter, but just letting you know that improvements have been made in this regard for this particular update to make view extrusion as easy to toggle between as possible. And you can just press Alt to jump back between System A, and you can even tap Alt again to switch back to System B in the event that you miss it and want to just control the amount of extrusion that you're doing by the distance that you're moving your mouse. The key to understanding Boxcutter is that it is a tool of fallbacks. Our goal is to assist you no matter the case. So if you begin drawing over the mesh, you will perform basically a regular surface oriented drawing. If you begin drawing off of the mesh, we will orient your drawing to view, allowing you to just perform your extrusion based on view, which is an alternative way to use Boxcutter, alternative to drawing oriented to the surface. However, if you have nothing selected at all, we also have a fallback for that, where you begin drawing oriented to the world. In this case, my world is set to Y. I need to set it to Z, but once you have your world set to Z, you can begin drawing on the ground floor of your world, just begin creating shapes without any issue, jump through all the shapes and just create shapes on the fly without any issue whenever you're using make, because nothing is selected and we have our world set to Z. However, if we begin drawing from the side, we have it set up where you can begin drawing from the side axes, but when you bring grid into the mix, it begins to get more complicated. Because our world is set to Z, that means we'll only see our grid on the grid floor, but if we look at it from the side, we don't see grid at all at this point, and that's because we need to change our orientation method to be using Y. So now that it's on Y, it's not showing up. We have to go to X, and now we're able to see it on X. And this isn't the way that we intended Boxcutter to be used. In fact, you having to rotate your view and then change your world to Y in order to begin drawing on the world on the Y axis is something that was definitely not part of the plans. It's just a needless complication for users. So for that reason, we attempted to perform some improvements on this latest update of Boxcutter 7.18. And currently I'm using it in Blender 2.93, and if we show it in action, basically I can have grid enabled, and if we just begin drawing, of course I'm able to draw from surface and view just like I was showing previously. I can of course even press G to grab my shapes and move them around. However, if we were to deselect and we bring up our grid, we see that we have our grid oriented to the world. However, if we look at it from the side, like we are now, we also see that the grid now knows to orient itself to the side whenever you're no longer looking at it from front. And the same thing with all the axes. So this is something that has been long awaited when it comes to world, just a way to make world smart and reduce the need for users to even have to know about the world parameter and go in and change any axis. So just know that as of this update, you'll now be able to use world orientation without any issue, just even as a fallback to object. And when using in conjunction with grid, you shouldn't even have to go in and change any parameters or do anything to bring it up. It should just work out of the box. When it comes to Boxcutter, there's multiple systems of alignment. In order to show this in action, we'll Shift A, add a plane, and we'll press Alt V and just make sure wireframe is on. And now whenever I draw a box, I could press R during the draw and just draw this, press R to rotate. And we see that every time I draw a box, the initial orientation is set up to be oriented to the local object that we have at hand, meaning that every time I draw, the shape is drawn straight and I'm having to press R in order to rotate. However, if we press Shift V, we can bring up our orientation helper and we can change this over to nearest edge. And what this means is whenever I hold control and begin using the grid, I'll begin orienting the grid to the nearest edge, which is something that you're already aware of. And that means, of course, I can get in here and begin drawing even more shapes, just using the grid as kind of a jump off point to just quickly get started. However, a new mode has been added under Shift V called Face Fit, where whenever enabled, we'll attempt to orient the grid similar to nearest edge, except it's actually orienting it according to the face that's inside. So if we go back to this area, we see that this area is being calculated based off of this face that's underneath the cursor. Same with this one, just allowing us to get an even better orientation than the one that you might have been used to previous. But it is a new system to Boxcutter. While we're using it with Gridfinite, there's not a whole lot to see. However, as we begin continuing on with this release log, you'll see some additional cases in which Face Fit can come in handy. In fact, here we see me calculating with control the face fit for this particular region, and it gives us something more akin to local. But if I press control here, it gives us something more akin to the face that's actually inside of the area where control is pressed. So hopefully that should give you an idea in a nutshell, and also showing how I can just use control to just tap and see what sort of orientation I get without even having to begin drawing the shape. So traditionally in Boxcutter, we had a grid where whenever you hold control, you're able to just roll the wheel to make the grid larger and smaller on the fly as needed. However, whenever it came to extending on its functionality, we also added a few additional options to try to make people's lives easier. For example, right now, in order to keep this grid up, I have to hold control, and the moment I release control, the grid is gone. However, I could activate this lock icon where if I tap control, the grid will remain up on screen, allowing me to work without the need to have to hold down control. However, I could hold down control in order to roll the wheel in order to make the grid smaller, and this was kind of the foundation of our classic grid, and below is me using it in action like so with this classic system. And of course, we added support for it to be able to support all the orientation systems. So for example, I can choose something like nearest edge and just grab an edge very close to where I cut that angle and begin working off of that angle and continuing on with my day with performing the cut. And that was where we kind of left off with the infinite grid. Under snapping options, you can bring down the snap drop down, and from here under grid type we could change from infinite to static. Static is a new type of grid, and I'll begin going over what can be expected with this particular type of grid. So same controls to bring it up. We hold control and we're able to bring up the grid. Since I'm using nearest edge, we're actually orienting it to the nearest edge similar to before. Some of the new things you can actually do with this grid is while I'm holding control, I can control and right click in order to extend the grid, which is one of my favorite things to do. Also love holding down control and shift in order to freely extend the grid however I'd like. Once the border turns black, that means that the grid is in a locked state, meaning that no matter how I rotate the view, the grid will remain where it is positioned. If I hold down control and I roll the wheel, you see I'm able to, of course, make things scale up and scale down. But if I hold shift and roll the wheel, you can see I'm able to add additional subdivisions. The key thing with this particular grid in comparison to our previous attempt is that we're able to support many more cells on the grid than we were before. An important thing to also note with this grid is if we press Shift V and we change over to face fit, whenever we press control over the surface, we'll see it attempt to fit the grid to the particular face that's located under the mouse. So in this case, it actually didn't show up as I would expect. However, it does give you a nice starting point for you to be able to just draw out your grid, subdivide it, and just get in and get to work. In fact, you could press Tab in order to unlock the grid and be able to freely move it around, or you could even press spacebar to lock and unlock the grid just on the fly. Another interesting thing about this grid is you can press R in order to rotate. You could hold down control during rotate in order to do fine rotation or moving it on certain degree increments. You could press R and X, Y, and Z to rotate it as you would normally expect. In addition to that, you can also press S in order to scale the grid. Having your mouse cursor on the border whenever you press S allows you to scale it evenly. However, if you have the mouse somewhere on the inside and you press S, you'll see that the grid will scale abnormally. So usually I have my mouse position on the edges, press S, and then I'm able to scale it very gracefully. But the most important thing to remember is that anytime you want to extend it, you can just press E and jump into an extension mode, click to place it. You can press E, hold control and shift and freely extend it, click and just place it. And of course, most importantly, anytime you want to get rid of the grid, just press escape to remove the grid. So really it's that easy when it comes to getting started with the grid. In fact, I can just go select my area that I want to get started with, draw my grid, subdivide it into place. From here I begin drawing. We can see that the moment I begin working, the grid begins lowering its opacity, so that way I can focus on the mesh, which is the most important part of this matter, not so much the grid. However, if you like, you can also turn off auto opacity on the fly. So that's where some of these options come in. So the first one I want to talk about is dot preview. In fact, we'll just turn everything else off until it becomes relevant. Dot preview means that static has a level of interactivity with dot. So by having this on, if we turn off grid, we can see that there's now a red square showing whenever you hover over dots. The cool thing about this is if you roll the wheel, it will just turn that dot into a grid. So for example, I'll come over to this area, hover over the dot, just looking at the various alignment solutions that are being offered. I can press Shift V, we'll change this back to nearest edge, and really grab this area that we want, roll the wheel, and now we have a grid actually spawning from that particular point in space. We could be subdividing it. We could press RX in order to rotate it on the X to get it positioned exactly how we want. Continuing subdividing it, press D to go through our pie menu, even canceling it should be able to keep this grid up on screen active. In fact, we've tried everything in our power to make this grid as static as possible. even though this grid's a little off as far as for the shape I'm attempting to create. We'll be able to pull it off. And now we jump to the extrusion process. We'll just press T to give it a little thickness, bring it up, and that is basically dot preview. So sometimes you may want to have your grid off and then just hold control in order to read over the surface, see what your solutions are going to be. And then once you have the alignment point that you want, you can just roll in order to jump into the grid where it will start in an automatically pause state, which is an ideal state for using dots as a jump off for grid. So it's definitely a bigger and different expansion than what we'd normally be doing with our infinite line, but static offers something a little bit different when it comes to how dots and grid coalesce. So the next one I want to talk about is toggle grid overlay. So for this one, basically if we look at this from side view, we see that there's a grid up on screen, and if we actually turn on our grid, we can see that with this toggle on, that the view grid for Blender actually disappears, allowing you to get a better grid result. This option was added because there were some occasions where if you have your grid up in addition to Blender's grid at the same time and you begin subdividing points, you might notice that there's just a little bit of difference between our grid and Blender's grid, and you can actually get it to be exactly the same way by getting it on the right numerical amount. However, it's just sometimes easier to focus on the model at hand and actually get rid of the grid in order to ensure that you're able to draw it the way that you want to, instead of trying to orient it exactly with Blender's grid in the background. So for that reason, toggle grid overlay is on, just in case you want to toggle the particular grid that's in the background off. As you can see, in addition to this, this static grid supports surface, view, and world, just like you would expect with any of our grids. The next one I want to talk about is always in front. So if we were to look over the surface and we set our grid down, we see that this grid is actually showing no matter what. We can't see any sort of obscuring happening with this grid because of it penetrating with the surface, and that is because always in front is on. If you turn always in front off, we can see that the grid is, while it's locked, we are able to see it show up in some places but not in other places, and this is where the snapping difference with the surface is beginning to exist. So it's just letting you know that this is happening, and for that reason we have an option with static grid to either show it in front like you're seeing here, or have the grid actually disappear whenever it's being obscured by a mesh. So this can actually come in handy whenever you're, say, working on the surface and you're trying to do something and tell exactly how far into the surface that you're penetrating. It also became brought to my attention that we possibly need to come up with a layering system so that way we can have a semi-transparent mesh whenever it's intersecting with the mesh, but for now we do have the option to at least have the grid obscured whenever it has a penetration with the solid mesh. The next one I want to talk about is auto transparency, which basically we have our grid up. If we were to tab it, in fact, let's actually place it on the top level and hold Control Shift, roll this out, Shift roll a few segments in, and we're already inside of Ngon, and we'll just begin drawing. And notice that the moment I begin drawing, the grid goes into a semi-transparent state. And this is something that was done intentionally to ensure that even if you're using the grid in edit mode, you're able to still recognize the mesh underneath and what's going on, instead of having it be obscured by the grid, which was something we were trying to avoid with our infinite grid to begin with. However, for this, I'll turn transparency off, and let's actually orient the grid to this nearest edge. And we'll just lock that in and Control Shift drag to extend it out. And we'll just draw a shape here. And just like that, we can see the grid failing to actually go into an auto transparent mode during drawing. So the grid is set up for users to be able to set up to however they like, but all these toggles are there in order for you to customize this to your best experience. There's a lot of interesting things with this grid that have yet to be expanded on, and for now will probably seem like a mystery until we expand on it further in the future. One of those is that you can literally draw a grid mesh. You can add your subdivisions however you want, and you can press Shift G and it will just drop it as a mesh. This is something that was added because I asked for it. However, in the future it'll definitely become a lot more handy, but for now just know that it's the precursor to us being able to drop the grid as a mesh, and hopefully later be able to recall, reuse, and recall grid positions. I talked about previously how there were some differences with the way dots behave inside of static versus infinite. One of those is that you can tap control and the dots will just stay on screen. However, they'll no longer begin searching under your active cursor. I believe this has been done in order to increase stability and have it crash less. However, we could see that we could just tap control, the dots will remain on screen. We're able to zoom in and out because as of now, Boxcutter now has 3D dots. Previously, there were 2D dots, which were deemed incompatible with our 3D grid. And we're able to just hover over each dot, seeing what potential alignment point we're being given before we even begin drawing. And if we want to expand this into something more staticky, like static grid, we could just hold control, roll the wheel, roll this grid into place, playing off of the angle that we chose, just extend the grid out however we'd like, shift, roll the wheel in order to bring it out, and here we are able to rock and roll with our grid. So the holding control in order to statically keep the dots is something that I found to be a little bit interesting of a curiosity. However, another example I want to show is that if we press control in and make a new file, I'll just delete this cube, press control spacebar to control shift spacebar to go full screen, and we'll just shift A at our plane, alt V wireframe, and we just want to switch over to box, shift X. And I just want to show another interesting thing about static grid at this time, and that is the face fill capabilities that it has at this time. This was something that we had a little bit stronger in the development process. However, near the end, it became a bit tricky to get integrated with certain systems, so we had to dial it back a little bit. So if I press Shift V, we can change this over to face fit, and if we turn on grid and we hold control over the grid, we see that the grid is actually catered to fit the face that it was tracing over. However, of course, it's always going to try to place the grid in an area similar to where you started off. So right here we see that the central point is here. It's not going to fit the grid to fit over this face in object mode. However, if we go and hover over some of these individual faces and just hold control and roll our grid, we see that we're able to get a really interesting orientation system happening here when it comes to the initial positioning of our grid. And this is just one of those things that even right here I kind of ponder why it's being obscured. However, it could be because we're using a two-dimensional planar object, so in these cases you probably want to have auto transparency toggled off. However, I am still wondering why the grid is showing beneath the mesh here but on top of the mesh here. So this is definitely a curiosity, but isn't a game changer. Except we really do need the grid to show up where it's supposed to. You know, how are we supposed to work with it when it's stuck on the other side? Let's press Alt V, look at face orientation, and we see the culprit of what happened. So this isn't even so much an issue that I need to report back to the team to drive them further insane. It's us needing to get in and actually troubleshoot the situation and see what's happening with our face orientation. So there's a degree of offset that happens with the grid and the surface in order to make sure that it's sitting on top of the surface. However, if your face is flipped, it's going to actually do the opposite of that. So just a little bit of troubleshooting on the fly there, but now we see that we are in business and every face is behaving as you would expect. And so this could come in handy for cases where you want to work a particular face or just start your grid off there and begin subdividing and begin drawing your shapes oriented to the shape happening on the inside, as you see me doing here, just using knife box. But with that, I just want to show a few additional curiosities with the new static grid and the way it behaves with dots, just to give you a heads up that you may be experiencing some differences whenever you use the static grid compared to its general behaviors expected with infinite. So here I have snapping and grid enabled, and I'm currently set to infinite. If we set up infinite, we see that this is the smallest that this is able to go. If I roll the wheel, I'm able to basically adjust it to the size that's needed. In fact, I can roll this grid as far out as needed without any limit, and that is basically the foundation of the name Gridfinite. However, whenever it comes to adding additional points to it, that's where things get a little sticky with this particular iteration of grid. So if we were to go into the grid settings and set this to something like 50, and we bring up the grid, we see that performance begins choking to a standstill. And this is something that I'm able to show today because we'll definitely be solving it tomorrow. But for now, just notice how whenever you bring up a grid like this, it just just begins choking, and not even the dot's able to keep up with my cursor at this point. And really it's not needed for us to have the grid at so high a unit count. Even something like 10 will definitely just do the job, and you really don't need to see so many points at the same time whenever you're working. However, there is a contingency of users who do feel the need to see so many points at the same time, and AR just happens to be one of them. So if we just bring out our grid and control right click to bring this out, we are able to basically scroll an impossibly high amount of points into this grid and roll our view around and everything, and just continue maneuvering without any sort of difficulty. And if we zoom in, we can see that we have the finest lattice of grid points ever. I mean, really, it's ridiculous to even work at such a fine amount of grid points, but I'm happy to see that it's able to perform so quickly and so nimbly without issue, even though normally with the other grid, this would normally just be the end of it and Blender would just be turning white and the session would end. And best of all, I can of course just press escape to get rid of it, but at any time I want to, I can just align to an edge because I'm under Shift V nearest edge, bring my grid in, maybe even Shift right click, Control right click to drag it out, and just roll in just an impossible amount, and zoom in on it, hold Shift and roll to adjust how many I need exactly. But this is one of the main differences between the two grids, is because of the technology at their foundation, that this one's just inherently fast. This one's just going to be a faster solution at this time, but we will be coming back to deal with Infinite in this respect. So previously I don't believe I talked about S, or as far as S and its capacity and its usage with the static grid. So here I am pressing Control in order to snap it to the nearest edge, and I'll just hold Control and Shift in order to free extend. And then from here I can press S in order to scale it out. I can also hold Shift at this point and begin to break the rules of what a grid is to me. This was something I talked about a lot internally. I was like, we shouldn't be able to do this. However, we see that it actually made it to the finish line, where basically if you want your grid to be a set of units that are unequal to equidistant square units, you can do that by just holding Shift during the scale operation and then just clicking, and you're still able to of course hold Shift and roll in additional subdivisions, but you'll see that the proportions are different than what you're normally used to. And so I can always just escape to remove the grid and just draw in another grid in order to do it again. However, at any time you could just press S in order to scale, hold Shift, and freely scale it in order to get a particular type of grid that normally I wouldn't go for. Like for example, here I have some very rectangular units. I'll press Tab and lock it. However, I let go of the keys in the wrong order. So if I press S again, I will hold Shift, and before releasing Shift, I will click in order to end that operation, and then I can release Shift. And then from here I can press Shift and roll to begin adding additional segments. So in the event that I was trying to just really break the rules of what grid is, I can do it as you see here. However, it also seems to be affecting the bevel in this particular case. So definitely use scaling your grid with caution, but just letting you know that it is something that is supported by grid, even though I personally don't endorse it. Here we are in 2.83.13 using Boxcutter 717_18. And in this previous version, if I were to draw a box and press B to bevel and press Q in order to Q bevel, I could also press Shift F to flip that bevel to be at the top of this shape, which gives me a more interesting kind of shape here, one of the new additions to the previous version of Boxcutter. And now I'll use the grid with Shift V and using local, and we'll just repeat that shape right here. And we'll repeat that shape again, and we'll repeat that shape again, and we'll continue repeating this shape just to drive home that all these shapes that we're repeating look absolutely nothing like this shape. And so let's go ahead and just use Q, ever scroll, and just recall this shape. If we look at this cutter actually didn't get its vertex group information saved, and whenever it was repeated incorrectly. So as a result, it just drew this shape in a way that looks nothing like the previous shape. And this is kind of a small thing, but it did irk me. So as a result, here we are in Blender 2.93.0, because I never learned, using Boxcutter 718.3. And for this one, we're just going to do that same shape again, except this time I am going to use the static grid and we'll lock it in, and we'll just bring a box up here, press B, press Q, press Shift F in order to flip it. Maybe give it one segment to give us an easy time with the shading. And because I use center draw, that means that I can just hold Control and double click in order to just easily center draw clone this. If I were to have drawn it from the corner, I would be double clicking the corner. But here we are bringing this shape in, and it looks exactly the same as the shape that we took out. So just letting you know that this was something that just kind of irked me for a moment. We're always wanting to make sure that repeat is in its best shape, and with this update, I'm definitely proud to say that we now support V-groups the way that we're supposed to. In fact, to finish this out, we will just go into modifier scroll and just perform an auto scroll just to let these shapes roll their way out. So here we are back in the previous version, and if I draw a line with Ngon Cyclic, a rather thick line, and we click to make it solid and we press B to bevel, we see that it just doesn't work out. In fact, let's press B twice to remove the bevel, and that is our shape. Let's try drawing it just one more time before jumping over. And we click, we press B, we see that the bevel just doesn't come in right, and this is because the order in which the modifiers are being sorted on this particular shape is just off at this time. So while it looks like a good shape in a solid way, the bevel experience just wasn't the experience that we wanted for you, the user. So for that reason, we did improve it in the latest version. So I'll just make a new file, delete everything, and we'll just go in Ngon and just draw a shape. And I'll press C in order to toggle cyclic. We can press T in order to increase the thickness. We can press B in order to bevel. Of course, bevel can still go wayward because bevel is just bevel when it comes to these sort of things. But now, whenever you begin working with it, it should behave the way it's supposed to. So here we are bringing it out, extruding it, click, apply, and we look at the wireframe and we get a proper wireframe for this compared to what we were looking at previously. So I'll do another bevel line over here. Right click to finish, press B to bevel, click to extrude, and done.